$430,000. That is what my parents left me when they died. I found out 22 years later. Let me tell you what those 22 years looked like. I missed the 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. because we couldn't afford the deposit. I wore the same winter coat for 3 years in high school because there was no money for a new one. I taught myself to drive at 19 on a borrowed car because driving lessons were a luxury we couldn't justify. I took out $46,000 in student loans to pay for a degree that my parents had already paid for. They just didn't know their money had been stolen. And the woman who stole it stood at a bus station when I was 18 years old, watched me leave with everything I owned in 2 bags, and said, "I've given you everything I had." She had. Just not to me. Here is what happened. My parents died in a car accident when I was 7. Black ice. A highway. A truck that crossed the center line on a November morning while I was sitting in 2nd grade, learning to spell words I still remember. Both of them were gone before I got out of school. My Aunt Sylvia became my legal guardian. She took me in, raised me, and for 22 years told me, in every way a person can tell a child something without saying it directly, that I was a financial burden she had sacrificed her life to carry. What she did not tell me was that my parents had each taken out life insurance policies, that both policies named me, their 7-year-old daughter, as the sole beneficiary, that as my legal guardian, she had the ability to redirect those funds, and that she had done exactly that, from the very first payment, for years, into an account with her name on it. I did not find out from a lawyer. I did not find out from a document. I found out from my second cousin at a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, over lattes neither of us finished, when she looked at me across the table and said words I will never stop hearing. "She never told you. She never told you." Everything collapsed in that moment. Every sacrifice Sylvia had described. Everything she said she couldn't afford to give me. Every time I had felt, without being able to name it, like a debt that could never quite be repaid. It collapsed and rearranged itself into a shape I could suddenly, horrifyingly, read clearly. I went home that evening and started pulling on threads. 3 weeks later, I had policy documents, account records, withdrawal dates, and a paralegal sitting across from me saying, "This is not a gray area. $430,000, paid out over years, spent on a life I was told I was too expensive to be part of. This is the story of what I did about it." But before I go on, if what I've just told you is already sitting somewhere inside you that recognizes it, if you have ever been made to feel like a burden by the very person who was supposed to protect you, hit like and subscribe. Not as a reflex. Only if this genuinely reaches something in you. And drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. There's something that matters to me about knowing where people are when this story finds them. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because before I can tell you what was taken, I need to tell you what existed before the taking. And what existed before was worth grieving properly. My name is Nora. I'm 29 years old. I work in hospital administration in a mid-sized city I chose specifically because it was far enough from where I grew up to feel like mine. I have a good apartment, a job I'm proud of, and a therapist I see every other Tuesday who has, over the past year, had to significantly revise the framework we'd been using to understand my childhood. My father was named David. He was a high school history teacher, which sounds unremarkable until you understand that he treated everything. The drive to the grocery store, the weather, a disagreement about a movie, like a story worth paying attention to. He had a habit of starting sentences with, "Here's the thing though," and then saying something that made you look at whatever you'd been discussing from an entirely different angle. I have met very few people in my adult life who could do what he did, which was make you feel like the most interesting person he had ever talked to, and mean it every time. My mother was named Lena. She was a nurse, and she carried her work home in the best possible way. Not the exhaustion of it, though that was there too, but the specific attentiveness that her job required. She noticed things. She noticed when you were quieter than usual, and she noticed when you were pretending to be fine, and she noticed the particular way I liked my sandwiches cut, which was diagonally, and she cut them that way without ever being asked, for my entire life, every single time. That is the kind of detail that seems small until the person who held it is gone. They met in college, married young by most modern standards, and had me at 26. By the time I was 7, they had built what I can only describe as an ordinary life made extraordinary by the quality of attention they brought to it. We were not wealthy. My father's teacher salary and my mother's nursing income made us comfortable in the way that requires some management, modest vacations, used cars, no anxiety about groceries. What we had in abundance was the thing that cannot be budgeted for or replaced. They felt like home. I did not have the vocabulary for that at 7. I only knew that I was, in some fundamental and unexamined way, completely safe. My Aunt Sylvia was my mother's older sister by 4 years. She appeared at the edges of my early life the way extended family does. Christmas, Thanksgiving, the occasional Sunday visit. I liked her in the uncomplicated way children like adults who are pleasant to them. She brought good gifts. She laughed at my jokes. She called me her little architect because I liked to build elaborate structures out of whatever I could find. I had no reason to look more closely. Children rarely do. My parents named Sylvia as my legal guardian in the event that something happened to them. I know this now. I did not know it then, and I suspect they chose her with the quiet confidence of people who cannot fully imagine the document they are signing ever actually being used. I was in 2nd grade on a Thursday morning in November when the truck crossed the center line. A woman I didn't recognize came to my classroom door at 11 a.m. and said my name. I remember the way my teacher looked at me when I stood up, a look I didn't understand until I was much older. The specific expression of an adult who knows something a child doesn't yet, and is trying to hold her face in a shape that buys a few more seconds of before. I did not go home that day. I never went home again. What I did not know, sitting in the back of that unfamiliar car watching my school disappear behind me, was that my parents had done everything right. They had planned for the unthinkable. They had made sure that if the worst happened, I would be taken care of, not just housed and fed, but genuinely, substantially provided for. They had paid the premiums every month. They had named the beneficiary with care. They had left me everything they had. What happened to that everything is the story I'm here to tell you. I moved into Sylvia's house 14 days after the funeral. I know it was 14 days because I counted them. I was 7 and I had nothing to do but count things, the days, the stairs in Sylvia's house, the number of times people said I'm so sorry without quite meeting my eyes. Grief arithmetic. It is what children do when the adults around them are busy with arrangements. The house on Clemson Street was a tan colonial with black shutters and a garden Sylvia maintained with the focused energy of someone who needed something she could control. It smelled like candles and laundry detergent, and something underneath both of those things that I could never name, but that meant, simply, not home. Sylvia was not cruel. I want to say that clearly because the story I'm telling could make it easy to assume she was a monster from the beginning, and the truth is more complicated and, in some ways, worse. She enrolled me in the local school within the week. She attended my parent-teacher conferences. She made dinner every evening, and the food was good. She did the things that, from the outside, looked exactly like what raising a child looks like. What was absent was harder to describe. Her son Marcus was 10 when I arrived. He had his mother's ease, the kind of kid who filled a room without trying, who had friends who came over on weekends, whose birthday was an event with a cake and balloons and a guest list. I did not begrudge Marcus any of this. I liked him, actually. He was kind to me in the distracted way of a 10-year-old who has more interesting things to focus on but defaults to decency when your paths cross. My first birthday in that house, I turned 8. There was a card on the breakfast table and a small stuffed bear that I still have, actually, somewhere in a box. Sylvia said happy birthday and made my favorite dinner. It was fine. It was perfectly fine. It just wasn't a party. I noticed this the way children notice everything, without judgment at first, simply as data. Marcus had parties. I had dinners. I filed it and moved on. What I filed more carefully, because it repeated more often, was the money talk. Sylvia mentioned finances the way some households mention weather, regularly, matter-of-factly, as a constant backdrop to daily decisions. There was the discussion of whether we could afford the new backpack I needed or whether last year's would do. The explanation that the school trip deposit was more than they could manage this month. The particular tone that entered her voice when I asked for anything that cost money. Not angry, not unkind, just weighted, just heavy with the implication of sacrifice already made, and sacrifice still ongoing. By the time I was 10, I had developed a precise internal calculator. I knew, before asking for anything, how to estimate its likelihood of a yes. I learned to want less, not because I was told to explicitly, but because the air in that house had a particular pressure around the subject of money, and I, like any child who needs to survive a climate, adapted to it. I assumed I was the reason for the pressure. She was raising 2 children on 1 income. I knew this because she said it, not cruelly, just as fact. She was doing her best. She was managing. She was sacrificing. I believed her completely. Looking back now, I do the math differently. Sylvia worked as an office manager at a law firm for 20 years. A stable salary, 1 biological son who required no more resources than any other child. And then there was me. The additional expense. The reason the budget was tight. The variable that changed everything. Except I wasn't a variable. I was a revenue stream she had quietly redirected. I didn't know that then. I just knew that the kitchen renovation happened the summer I turned 15, and it was beautiful. New countertops, new cabinets, a farmhouse sink that Sylvia showed everyone who came through the door. I just knew that Marcus got a car at 17, and I got a bus pass. I just knew that when I got into college on a partial scholarship and a lot of hope, Sylvia drove me to the bus station and said those words. "I've given you everything I had." I thanked her. I picked up my 2 bags. I got on the bus. And I didn't look back for a long time. There is a particular kind of poverty that isn't about money. It's about being told, repeatedly and in enough different ways that it becomes its own weather system, that you are too much, that your needs exceed what is reasonable, that the correct response to existing is gratitude, and the correct volume for your needs is somewhere just below audible. I did not have that vocabulary at 15 or 18 or even 22. I have it now. And looking back at my adolescence through it changes everything I thought I understood about those years. Let me give you the specific inventory. Not to perform suffering. I am long past needing sympathy for a childhood I have already survived. But because specificity is the only thing that communicates what accumulated silence actually costs. 8th grade. My class took a 5-day trip to Washington, D.C. I had been looking forward to it since 6th grade. I had a list, genuinely, of every monument I wanted to see. The deposit was due in October. Sylvia sat me down in September and explained, with the careful tone she used for financial conversations, that it wasn't something they could manage this year. I nodded. I told my teacher I wouldn't be attending. I spent that week in a different classroom doing worksheets, while everyone else sent photos from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I still haven't been to Washington, D.C. Junior year of high school. My guidance counselor, Mr. Patton, pulled me aside after class to tell me I should be thinking about college applications. He asked if I had a list of schools. I said I wasn't sure college was realistic. He looked at me for a long moment and asked why. I told him what I knew, that money was tight, that I didn't want to be a burden, that I was thinking about working for a year first and saving up. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nora, you have a 4.1 GPA. Let me make some calls." He found me fee waivers for every application. He nominated me for 2 scholarships I didn't know existed. He did more for my future in 3 weeks than anyone with actual legal responsibility for me had done in a decade. I think about Mr. Patton often. Driving. I did not learn until I was 19. Every year from 16 onward, I raised it with Sylvia, and every year there was a reason. The insurance cost, the scheduling, the timing. By the time I accepted it wasn't going to happen through her, I borrowed a friend's mother's car on 3 Sunday mornings and taught myself in an empty parking lot. I passed my test on the first attempt. I did not tell Sylvia about the test. College. I got into a state university on a partial academic scholarship. The gap between the scholarship and the actual cost was significant. I applied for every financial aid program Mr. Patton helped me find. I took out loans for the rest, $46,000 over 4 years, a number I knew by heart because I checked the balance the way some people check the weather. Constantly, compulsively. As a reminder of what the stakes were, I worked through all 4 years. The campus library my first year, a restaurant my second and third, a hospital administrative office my fourth, which is how I found the field I now work in. Something good came from the necessity. It usually does, when you've spent enough years turning necessity into something livable. Here is what I did not do during any of those years. I did not call Sylvia and ask for help. Not once. The internal calculator I had built at 10 was still running, still telling me the answer before I asked the question, still telling me that my needs were too much, and that asking was the same as taking, and that the appropriate posture was gratitude for what existed, rather than requests for what didn't. That calculator was installed in a house on Clemson Street. It ran on a fuel source I wouldn't identify for another decade. Meanwhile, and I want you to hold this detail, the kitchen renovation was completed in the summer I turned 15. The summer Marcus turned 18. Sylvia bought him a used car. The year I left for college on loans, Sylvia took her annual beach vacation to the same resort she visited every year, the one with the balcony overlooking the water that she showed everyone in photos. I am not angry about those things anymore. I am something colder and more clarifying than angry. I am precise about them. I left that house at 18, with 2 bags and a loan balance, and a quiet, persistent belief that I was someone who had to earn everything twice. I had no idea how right I was. Or why. I want to tell you about the person I became before I knew the truth, because I think that person matters. Not as a preamble to the revelation, but as a thing in her own right. A woman who built something real without knowing that the foundation beneath her had been deliberately compromised. That takes a specific kind of stubbornness. I wasn't always sure it was a virtue. I am now. I studied healthcare administration at a state university 4 hours from Clemson Street. I chose it practically, the way I made most decisions in those years, by eliminating anything that felt like a risk I couldn't absorb. I was not following a passion. I was following the logic of someone who understood, at 18, that stability was not guaranteed, and that the safest thing you could build a life on was something people would always need. People would always get sick. Someone had to manage the systems around that. I could be that someone. I was good at it. That part surprised me. Not the studying. I had always been a good student, largely because school was the one place where effort had a direct and reliable relationship to outcome, which was not my experience of home. What surprised me was how naturally I took to the work itself. The organizing of complex systems, the navigation of institutional bureaucracy, the ability to hold a lot of moving pieces and find where the pressure was. It turned out extremely good at finding where the pressure was. I graduated in 4 years with a 3.8 GPA and $46,000 in debt, and a job offer from the hospital where I had worked my senior year. I took it the same day it arrived. My 20s were built in increments. The first apartment, small, loud neighbors, a radiator that made sounds like it was in genuine distress, mine. The slow paying down of loans on an entry-level salary that required a spreadsheet to manage. The promotions that came because I worked with the focused energy of someone who has never once taken stability for granted. I moved up, not fast, but steadily. By 27, I was managing a department. By 29, I was being asked to sit in rooms where decisions got made. I called Sylvia on holidays. I visited once a year. I sat at her kitchen table, the one with the expensive farmhouse countertops, and had the same careful surface conversation we always had, and left feeling the same thing I always felt leaving that house, which was a vague, unnameable diminishment. Like I had been reduced, slightly, just by re-entering that atmosphere. I did a year of therapy at 25. My therapist was a calm, precise woman named Dr. Reeves, who had a habit of waiting until I finished a sentence and then asking the question that made everything I'd just said feel like a preliminary to what I actually needed to say. She used the word parentified once to describe the role I had occupied in Sylvia's household, the child who learns to shrink their needs to match the tolerance of their caregiver. She used the phrase chronic scarcity mindset to describe the internal calculator I still ran constantly, even now, even with a salary and savings and no practical reason for it. I understood both concepts intellectually. I simply did not yet have the information that would have explained their origin completely. That information was sitting in an insurance company's database, in a probate filing from 1999. In an account with Sylvia's name on it that had been receiving monthly deposits since I was 7 years old. I did not know that. I just knew that something in my foundation felt off in a way I could not locate or fix. That no matter how much I built, there was a low-grade hum underneath it, a frequency of wrongness I had learned to live with, because it had always been there. The therapist helped. The work helped. The life I was building helped. But you cannot fully treat a wound you haven't correctly diagnosed. I was 29, and I was fine in the truest sense of the word, genuinely functional, genuinely proud of what I'd made, genuinely okay. I had metabolized the childhood, or thought I had. I had made peace with Sylvia, or something that functioned like peace. And then my second cousin Delia called and asked if I wanted to grab coffee. I said yes. I had no idea I was about to find out what I had actually been building on. The coffee shop was Delia's suggestion, a place near her hotel, neutral ground. The kind of low-key spot you choose when you haven't seen someone in 2 years, and want the option of leaving after 45 minutes, without it feeling rude. We ordered. We caught up. She asked about my job. I asked about her kids. It was easy in the way that conversations with people you don't know well but genuinely like are easy. No maintenance required, no history to navigate. Then she wrapped both hands around her cup, and her tone changed. Not dramatically, just shifted. The way a room shifts when someone closes a window you didn't realize was open. She said, "Can I ask you something kind of out of nowhere?" I said, "Sure." She said, "What did you end up doing with your parents' life insurance money?" I looked at her. She looked back. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The expression that moved across her face in the following 3 seconds is one I have replayed many times. It was not surprise exactly. It was the expression of someone whose suspicion has just been confirmed. A terrible confirmation. The kind that brings no satisfaction whatsoever. She put her cup down. She said, quietly, "She never told you. She never told you." I sat very still. What followed was not a dramatic conversation. There was no raised voices, no crying, no moment of theatrical collapse. It was 2 women sitting at a small table, while an acoustic playlist moved through the room, and one of them told the other something that rearranged 22 years of understanding in about 15 minutes. Here is what Delia knew. Her mother, Sylvia's cousin, a woman named Pat who had been close with my mother growing up, had been at Sylvia's kitchen table the week after my parents' funeral. She had been there when Sylvia made a phone call to an insurance company. She had been there when Sylvia wrote something down on a notepad and circled it. She had not known, at the time, what to do with what she'd witnessed. She'd filed it under things adults do during estate administration and told herself it was legitimate. But it had stayed with her. And over the years, in the particular way that unexamined things tend to resurface, it had come out once, just once, in a conversation with Delia that Pat clearly immediately regretted having. She had told Delia there were insurance policies, that the money was supposed to go to me, that she wasn't sure what had happened to it. Delia had been carrying this for 3 years. She had almost called me twice. She had talked herself out of it both times, telling herself she didn't have enough information, that she could be wrong, that it would cause damage she couldn't repair. Then, she'd booked a work trip to my city and decided that carrying it any longer was its own kind of damage. I asked her how much she thought we were talking about. She shook her head. She didn't know. I drove home in a state I have struggled to describe accurately. It wasn't panic. It wasn't grief. It was something more like the feeling of a lens being corrected, the slight disorientation of suddenly seeing clearly something you have been squinting at for so long that the squinting felt normal. Every financial conversation in that house, every sacrifice catalogued and presented, everything that fell just outside what we could afford. Every loan I signed my name to. The kitchen renovation, Marcus's car, the beach resort with the balcony. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for a long time. Not crying, just thinking. Just running the numbers in a new direction and watching where they pointed. Then I went inside and opened my laptop. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet. I just knew that Delia was not a liar, and Pat was not a liar, and my parents were not people who would have left nothing behind for their 7-year-old daughter. I knew that much. So I started where you start, when you need to find something that someone spent 22 years making sure you wouldn't find. I started pulling on threads. The first thread I pulled was my father's former employer, the school district where he had taught for 9 years. I wanted to know if they had any records of employee benefits. Life insurance was often employer-provided. It was a place to start. They called me back the next morning. They had records. I want to tell you what 3 weeks of pulling threads actually looks like. It is not dramatic. It is not a montage. It is a lot of hold music. A lot of automated phone systems. A lot of emails that begin, "I'm trying to locate records related to a deceased family member," and then waiting. It is learning, quickly, which words open doors and which ones don't. It is the specific exhaustion of doing emotionally enormous work inside the format of administrative procedure. I was, fortunately, extremely good at administrative procedure. My father's school district confirmed within 24 hours that he had carried a group life insurance policy through his employer, standard for teachers in that district, 2 times annual salary, automatically assigned to the named beneficiary on file. I asked who the named beneficiary was. The HR coordinator put me on hold. When she came back, her voice had shifted slightly. Careful. The way people get when they sense they are handing someone something significant. She said, "The named beneficiary is listed as Nora Eleanor Walsh, a minor at the time of the claim. Me." It was me. I thanked her and hung up and sat at my kitchen table for 60 seconds, doing nothing. Then I picked the phone back up. My mother's hospital took longer. 4 days and 2 transferred calls before I reached someone in their legacy HR archive who could locate records from the late 90s. My mother had carried a private policy in addition to her employer coverage. She had taken it out 2 years before the accident, upgraded the payout amount once, and named her beneficiary clearly. Me again. I now had confirmation that 2 policies existed. What I needed was the paper trail showing what had happened to them after the claim was filed. That required a different approach. Probate records, which are public documents filed with the county court when an estate is processed. My parents' estate had been processed in 1999. Those records had been sitting in a county courthouse for 22 years, accessible to anyone who knew to look. I hired a paralegal named Sandra on a Thursday. By the following Tuesday, she had pulled the probate filing. We got on a call that evening. She walked me through it methodically. The way professionals do when they're delivering information they understand is not purely professional to the person receiving it. The estate filing confirmed both policies. It confirmed the payout amounts. It confirmed that as my legal guardian, Sylvia had filed on my behalf. And then it showed where the money went. Not into a court-supervised trust for the minor beneficiary, which is what the law required, which is what the probate notice explicitly outlined as the correct procedure. Into a personal account. Sylvia's account. Established the month after the claim was filed, the month I started second grade at my new school, the month I was learning the layout of a house on Clemson Street, and trying to understand why it didn't smell like home. Sandra was quiet for a moment after she finished walking me through it. Then she said, "This is not a gray area." I asked her what she meant. She said, "A legal guardian redirecting a minor's insurance proceeds into a personal account without court approval isn't a technicality. It's a violation. The law on this is not ambiguous." I asked her about the total. She put the numbers together while I waited. Both policies, full payout. She gave me the figure, $430,000. I wrote it down on the notepad next to my laptop. I looked at it. I thought about the Washington, D.C. trip, the $46,000 in loans I was still repaying, the driving lessons I taught myself in a parking lot, the bus station, the 2 bags. I thought about Sylvia at that bus station saying, "I've given you everything I had." I thought about my mother taking out a private policy 2 years before she died, upgrading the payout amount, making sure, deliberately and carefully, that if something happened, her daughter would be okay. My mother had tried to protect me. She had done everything right. And it had been undone in the month I started at a new school and counted 14 days and learned the smell of a house that would never be home. I closed my laptop. I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called a lawyer, not a paralegal. A lawyer. It was time to stop pulling threads and start deciding what to build from them. Claire Hendricks came recommended by a colleague who described her as someone who didn't perform outrage, but made opposing counsel deeply uncomfortable anyway. She was exactly that. She had a stillness in conversation that communicated more than most people's most animated moments. The stillness of someone who has heard a great many things and knows precisely which ones matter. I sat across from her on a Monday morning and laid out everything. The policy documents, the probate filing, Sandra's notes, the account records. I had organized it the way I organized everything at work, chronologically, clearly labeled, the relevant sections flagged. Claire went through it without interrupting. When she finished, she looked up and said, "How old were you when this started?" I said 7. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." She explained the legal landscape plainly. What Sylvia had done had a name: misappropriation of a minor beneficiary's funds. The probate court had issued explicit instructions about the establishment of a supervised trust. Those instructions had been ignored. The money had been redirected and spent. The statute of limitations on something like this was not straightforward. There were arguments to be made about when the clock started, and Claire believed we had a strong case that it started when I discovered the violation, not when it occurred. She had seen similar cases. She was not given to false reassurance. She told me that clearly, and then told me she thought we had a very strong position. We decided on a first step that was not a lawsuit. A formal letter, documented, legally precise, delivered by certified mail, notifying Sylvia that I was aware of the policies, aware of the redirected funds, and requesting a full financial accounting. It was, Claire explained, both a legal necessity and a strategic move. Sylvia's response to the letter would tell us everything we needed to know about how she intended to handle this. The letter went out on a Wednesday. We agreed I would call Sylvia the day it arrived, not to negotiate, not to give her an opportunity to explain, just to confirm she had received it, and to hear, in real time, what she did with the knowledge that I knew. Claire prepared me for the call the way a good lawyer prepares you for anything, by telling me exactly what not to say. Don't explain. Don't justify. Don't get pulled into a conversation about the past. Say what you need to say and get off the phone. I called on a Friday afternoon. Sylvia picked up on the third ring. Her voice was warm the way it always was. The particular warmth of someone who has never had reason to expect that a call from me would be anything other than routine. She asked how I was. She mentioned the weather. She was already halfway into the pleasant performance of our normal call when I stopped her. I said, "Sylvia, I need to ask you about my parents' life insurance policies." The silence that followed was not long, maybe 4 seconds. But it was a specific kind of silence, not confusion, not the pause of someone searching their memory. It was the silence of someone whose body has just understood something before their mind has decided how to respond to it. She did not say, "What are you talking about?" She did not say, "I don't know what you mean." What she said was, "Nora, I used that money to raise you. Every cent of it went to giving you a home." Not a denial. A justification. Immediate, prepared. The justification of someone who has been rehearsing it, not for this call specifically, but for the possibility of this call, the one she had perhaps always known might come someday. I had prepared for denial. The justification was, in its own way, worse. It meant she had always known. It meant that every conversation about money in that house, every stated sacrifice, every carefully communicated burden, she had known, the entire time, what was actually funding it. I let her finish. Then I said the only thing Claire had told me to say. "You should have received a letter from Claire Hendricks today. I'd suggest you read it." Then I hung up. I sat on my kitchen floor afterward, not crying, just present, just breathing, just sitting with the knowledge that the conversation I had been unknowingly waiting 22 years to have had just lasted less than 3 minutes and had told me everything I needed to know. She had always known. Now, finally, so did I. I want to tell you something about entitlement that I have learned from watching it up close. It does not fold when cornered. It escalates. It reframes. It finds the nearest available audience and performs for them, loudly and at length. Because the one thing entitlement cannot survive is being witnessed clearly. So it recruits witnesses who will see what it needs them to see instead. Sylvia's response to Claire's letter was not remorse. It was not even denial. Exactly. It was a campaign. She began with family. Within 72 hours of receiving that letter, she had called my mother's surviving cousin, my father's older brother, 2 neighbors who had known her for decades, and her closest friend from work. I know this because the calls started coming in. Cautious, uncomfortable. The calls of people who had been given a story and weren't sure what to do with it. The story was consistent across every version. Sylvia had sacrificed her life to raise a difficult, ungrateful child who was now trying to destroy her over money that had been rightfully spent on that very child's upbringing. She had given everything. She had asked for nothing. And this was what she got. My father's brother called me on a Sunday evening. He was a decent man in the way of someone who avoids conflict so successfully, he sometimes ends up on the wrong side of things without meaning to. He was not accusatory. He was confused and sad and clearly hoping I would say something that made the whole thing go away. I told him I couldn't discuss the details while legal proceedings were active. He said he understood. He did not call again. Marcus called on a Tuesday. That call was harder. Marcus was not his mother, I want to be fair about that. He was a man being asked to look directly at something about the person he loved most, and that is not a small thing to ask of anyone. His voice on the phone was the voice of someone genuinely fractured, not performing distress, actually in it. He said, "Nora, just tell me it's not what she's saying it is." I said, "Marcus, it's not what she's saying it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it worse?" I said, "Call me when you're ready to hear the actual version." I'll tell you everything." He didn't call back that week. I understood. I was not angry about it. I had not grown up in that house hating Marcus. I had grown up in that house understanding that Marcus and I had been positioned very differently within it, and that he had no more chosen that positioning than I had. Sylvia showed up at my apartment on a Thursday evening. I know she had been standing in the hallway for at least a few minutes before she knocked, because my neighbor mentioned it later. When I opened the door, she was composed, dressed carefully, the way she always dressed, for things that mattered to her, which told me she had thought about this visit in advance. She had prepared remarks. I let her get approximately 90 seconds in. She was covering familiar ground, the sacrifice, the difficulty, the years of her life she had devoted. When I said, "Sylvia, I have the account records. I have the probate filing. I have the policy documents. There is nothing you can say to me in this hallway that changes any of those things," she stopped. For just a moment, the first moment I had ever seen it, the composure dropped. Not into remorse, into something colder, the expression of someone recalculating. Then she said, "You are making a very serious mistake." I said, "Please don't come here again." I closed the door. She retained a lawyer 3 days later. Claire noted this with the professional neutrality of someone who had expected it. She also noted something else, that retaining a lawyer meant Sylvia was now legally required to provide a financial accounting. Every withdrawal, every expenditure, every dollar that had come in and everywhere it had gone, the kitchen renovation, the annual vacations, Marcus's car, 22 years of a lifestyle that an office manager's salary alone could not have sustained at the level she had maintained it. It was all about to become a document. Claire explained this to me on a Monday morning with her characteristic stillness. Then she said something I have thought about often since. She said, "People who do what she did always believe they won't get caught. And when they do get caught, they always believe they can still talk their way out. The paper trail is what they never account for." Sylvia had left a very long paper trail. A deposition is not a courtroom. There is no judge, no gallery, no gavel. It is a conference room with bad lighting and a water pitcher nobody touches, and a court reporter in the corner whose job is to record everything said with the same impassive expression regardless of what that everything turns out to be. It is, in some ways, more exposing than a courtroom, because there is nowhere to perform for. There is only the table, and the documents on it, and the questions that move through them one by one, with the patience of something that has already decided where it's going. Sylvia arrived in a burgundy blazer. I noticed it because I had seen her wear it before, at my college graduation, the one she attended and sat through and hugged me at the end of, the one that happened 4 years after she had already spent the money my parents left to fund it. She had worn that blazer to a graduation she had no right to feel proud at. I do not know if she chose it deliberately for the deposition or whether it was simply her armor and she reached for it without thinking. Either way, I noticed it, and I filed it, and I said nothing. Claire began with the documents. She does not raise her voice. She does not editorialize. She simply places a document on the table, identifies it for the record, and asks a question so precise it has only one honest answer. Watching her work is like watching someone dismantle something complicated with the exact right tools. No wasted motion, no drama, just the steady removal of one component at a time until the underlying structure is visible. The first document was the probate filing. Claire asked Sylvia to confirm that she had signed it. Sylvia confirmed. Claire asked her to read aloud the section outlining the legal requirement to establish a court-supervised trust for the minor beneficiary. Sylvia read it. Her voice was steady. Her lawyer objected to the framing of the next question, and Claire rephrased it without pausing. She asked Sylvia why the funds had been deposited into a personal account, rather than the court-supervised trust the filing had explicitly required. Sylvia said she hadn't understood that a separate trust was necessary. Claire placed the second document on the table. It was a notice from the probate court, sent to Sylvia's address, dated 6 weeks after the filing, reminding the guardian of her legal obligation to establish a supervised trust for the minor beneficiary's funds within 90 days. She asked Sylvia if she had received it. Sylvia's lawyer objected. Claire waited. The lawyer finished. Claire asked again. Sylvia said she may have received it but didn't recall its specific contents. The court reporter's fingers moved. The water pitcher sat untouched. The next documents were financial records. Claire moved through them with the same unhurried precision: account statements, withdrawal dates, transaction descriptions. She did not narrate them. She simply placed them in front of Sylvia one at a time and asked her to explain each one. The kitchen renovation permit pulled 3 months after a significant disbursement. A travel agency charge dated the summer I missed the Washington, D.C. trip. A car dealership transaction from the month Marcus turned 17. Line items, dates, amounts, each one its own quiet indictment, each one answered with some variation of the same response. The money had gone to household expenses, to the cost of raising 2 children, to the ordinary maintenance of a life. Claire let each answer settle before moving to the next document. At one point, Sylvia looked directly at me across the table. It was the first time she had. Her expression was composed, and beneath the composure was something I had seen in that hallway: the cold, recalculating look of someone still searching for the angle. She said, "I did the best I could with what I had." I looked back at her and said nothing. I did not need to say anything. Every document on that table had already said it. What I felt in that room was not the satisfaction I might have predicted. It was something quieter, the particular stillness of a person watching a story they have lived from inside, being told from outside for the first time. Documented. Entered into the record. Made. Finally. Officially. Real. The deposition ran for 3 hours and 40 minutes. When it ended, Sylvia stood, straightened her burgundy blazer, and left without looking at me again. Claire gathered her documents. She looked at me across the table and said simply, "She has nowhere left to go." She was right. The case settled 6 weeks after the deposition. I am not able to share the specific terms. What I can tell you is that it was more than the loans. It was more than the school trips and the driving lessons and every small thing that fell just outside the edge of what we could apparently afford. It was not $430,000. Some of that is simply gone, spent in ways that cannot be clawed back from time. But it was enough to feel, for the first time in my adult life, like the ground beneath me had not been secretly compromised by someone who was supposed to protect it. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans. I did it on a Thursday evening, alone at my kitchen table, in about 4 minutes of online banking. $46,000. Gone. I sat there afterward and let myself feel the full weight of what that represented. Not just the debt retired, but the version of my 20s that should have existed. The choices I might have made if I had known. The version of 22-year-old Nora, who didn't check her loan balance compulsively because the scarcity had been real and the fear had been legitimate, and no one had ever told her that the safety net existed and had been stolen before she was old enough to know she needed it. I'd cried at that kitchen table. Not briefly. At length. The kind of crying that has been waiting a long time for the right container. Then I ordered dinner and watched something completely mindless and went to bed. Sylvia and I have not spoken since the deposition. I do not expect we will. I have made my peace with that, in the way you make peace with things that were never going to resolve cleanly, not by arriving at acceptance all at once, but by choosing it repeatedly until it holds. Marcus reached out 2 months after the settlement. He had taken the time he needed, and when he came back honestly. No deflection, no both sidesing, no requests for me to consider his mother's perspective. He said he was sorry. He said he had spent the previous months going back through his childhood with new information, and that the process had been painful in ways he hadn't expected. He said he understood if I needed distance, and he understood if that distance was permanent. I appreciated the honesty enough to meet it with my own. I told him I didn't blame him for the position he'd been put in. I told him I wasn't ready for regular contact, but that I didn't want the door closed permanently either. We have exchanged a handful of messages since. Careful ones, but real. I went back to therapy. Not crisis therapy, something slower and more spacious. My new therapist has a different approach than Dr. Reeves. She asks less about the past and more about what I want the future to look like now that I'm building it on accurate information for the first time. It is a disorienting question. I spent so long operating under a false account of my own history that constructing a new one requires more imagination than I expected. I am still working on it. That is okay. Some things take the time they take. I visited my parents' graves in October. I had not been since I was a teenager. The distance was partly logistical and mostly emotional. The particular avoidance of someone who associates grief with a version of themselves they have been working to move beyond. I drove 4 hours on a Saturday morning, and I sat beside them for a long time. And I told them what had happened and what I had done about it. I told them about Claire and Sandra and the probate filing and the deposition. I told them about the settlement and the loans. I told them about the apartment I love and the work I'm proud of. And the friend who drove me to the airport once when I had an early flight and stayed in the parking lot until she saw me get inside. Because that is the kind of person she is. I told them they had done everything right. I think about that often. The deliberateness of my mother upgrading that policy. Sitting down with a form and thinking about her daughter and deciding to make the number larger. Doing it 2 years before she died. As though something in her understood that the doing of it mattered. She was trying to protect me. She did protect me. It just took 22 years and a Tuesday afternoon coffee and 3 weeks of hold music for the protection to arrive. It arrived. I am standing on solid ground. It took longer than it should have. It is mine. Thank you for being here through all 10 chapters. If Nora's story stayed with you, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. And if someone has ever stolen something from you that they were supposed to protect, I hope this reminded you that the paper trail has a way of surviving longer than the people who hoped you'd never find it.